lesson 5.02 in your U.S. History course, Part A, the lesson is entitled Freedom for All. This is a really good title for this lesson because what it focus on is the abolition movement and the women's rights movement. This is a carryover from our 501 lesson, Seeking Perfection, in which we were talking about other reform movements in the Reform era. Some of those movements were the education movement, the temperance movement, and the movement to improve conditions in prisons and asylums. We're picking up with abolition and women's rights movement. Now, the abolition movement, you may have heard the term before, but not know exactly what it means. And if that's the case, make sure that you pay particular attention to the definition, okay, within the course. The abolition movement is a crusade to end slavery in the United States. Okay, so that was the abolition movement within the United States. The goals for this lesson are to identify the leaders of the abolition and women's rights movement, describe the describe the inequalities women experienced in the early 19th century or early 1800s, identify the Seneca Falls Declaration of Sentiments and the reactions to it. Okay, so you're going to need to know what the Seneca Falls Declaration of Sentiments was, okay, and who wrote it and why it was controversial. So let's take a look at what we need to do for this lesson. Okay, it's going to ask you to make sure that you've completed the online review for the previous lesson, which you should have done in 501, and then read pages 342 to 349. There is a reading guide that goes along with this lesson, and again, it's very important to do so. You'll notice for 502 there is a quiz, and 502 quiz will include information from 501 and 502. So make sure that you're using your reading guide to identify areas where you may be struggling. Make sure you have the correct information. See me during office hours once you've identified those areas, but make sure you use this as a guide to help you for your quiz and then eventually for your Unit 5 test. You want to complete the document analysis declaration of sentiment sheet just for your own use. I will not be collecting that particular activity, but it can help you much like the reading guide. And read the chapter 14 highlights online as well at the end of this lesson. Okay, so let's take the online quiz as well. That will be your last step right here. Okay, so let's take a look. Without further ado, you're going to see that your reading guide is right here to download. Remember, you need to print that off and fill it in. Usually you have to write it in instead of typing it in because normally the PDF file will not let you type. Okay, so please do that first so you have that open while you read. And our reading, as we listed back on the previous slide, is 342 to 349. So let's take a look at what that is. 342 starts with the abolition movement and starts talking about it generally, describing it as a crusade to end slavery. Now, you might not know the exact term of crusade, but you probably can identify Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. It kind of means like an adventure or series of actions or an adventure to obtain a goal. So a crusade is like the religious crusades in history to obtain a specific goal, right? So it's a big action, a movement, if you will. And it's going to talk about some of the leaders within that movement. William Lloyd Garrison and Theodore Dwight Weld were two leaders within the abolition movement in the United States. So you're going to read about their involvement. You're also going to read about a movement at the time that was talking about the American Colonization Society. What many people were talking about, instead of finding abolitionism fulfilling in the United States, fulfilling their goal of getting rid of slavery, some people felt it would be best for slaves to be liberated but have their own society colonized in Africa, to go back to certain parts of Africa and start their own community there. So there was a movement for that kind of a solution, and many famous people, including very important politicians, were in support of that, including Abraham Lincoln early in his political career. Some other people who were leaders in the abolition movement would be the Grimke sisters and also two former slaves who would very actively speak out. Harriet Tubman, pictured here on the left on page 344, and then Frederick Douglass in the middle there on the top left of page 345. From here, it's going to pick up with the women's movement, okay, and talking about how many women at the time were really in a position of limited power. They had very limited influence. They were married to their husbands. They were expected to obey their husbands and do as they asked. They had no legal um, power. They could not bring a lawsuit. They could not um, sign a contract. They basically had no legal presence in U.S. society. A lot of times they couldn't even inherit property unless expressly stated by the father, brother, or husband. That should be the case. The Seneca Falls Convention was a convention of some leaders within society at this time that decided these women decided they were going to get together and talk about these injustices and create a document called the Declaration of Sentiments. Now, the Declaration of Sentiments was written at the Seneca Falls Convention and talked about the rights that women should have. One of the controversial issues, though, was it talked about the right to vote, and a lot of people, including women, a lot of women saw that as far too radical. So the convention didn't get a lot of support at first, but eventually over time it would. Now, keep in mind, we're talking about a time period in the early 1800s. Women would not get the right to vote for another 100 years. They would not get the right to vote on a national scale until 1920. Emma Willard and other female leaders in education are listed here and talked about in the next section. And then we talk about women debating their status, what their position is. And there was a lot of disagreement amongst even leaders within the reform movement of what kind of rights women should and should not have. So that was definitely a significant dispute. Okay. The spirit of reform is kind of summarized here as we get to the end of our explanation or our content for the reform era. So the spirit of form is kind of summarized here, and then they give a portion of the Declaration of Sentiments here with the cutaway talking about the Seneca Falls Convention and how that document came about. So please make sure that you read that in its entirety, because I'll give you a hint. There is a quote from this on the test, and you're going to have to be able to read from the document and tell me something about it. Okay. All right. So once you're done with that, you're going to come back into the lesson and review the previous lesson, Seeking Perfection. Okay, Seeking Perfection, there should be a little bit of a review there so you can again take a look at some of the other reform movements, and you have your reading guide and your document analysis. Okay, remember at the end you have your chapter highlights that you can go over. This is information that is key to the chapter. You should know this information. If you're going down this list and it doesn't sound familiar to you, or you're not sure you know the details of it, you need to review it, because I can guarantee it will show up in some shape or form on the test. Okay. Now remember, understanding goes beyond recognition. You shouldn't just be able to recognize a term or an idea. You have to be able to explain it. And that's one of the reasons why I haven't been seeing quiz or test scores as high as they could be, because students, I think, are going in with some knowledge, but not enough to really truly understand the concept and pick the appropriate questions. Okay. Then when you're done with the highlights, make sure that you do take the lesson quiz, and it will prompt you to do that on the second to last slide. All right, good luck on your 5.02 quiz. Please contact me with any questions.